Happy Monday, everybody. Every Monday I do a best of 1, best of 3 standard review. And we've got some good stuff coming down the line here for week 3 of Duskmourn. The number 1, according to Untapped, which is a third-party tracker, is Boros Auras. And it's been Boros Auras for a while. And there is a couple of changes we see this week. So we're bringing in the 2 copies of the Monastery Swiftspear, dropping a Demonic Ruckus and the Atali's Favor, to bring in a 4th copy of the Feather of Flight. And what this does is, you're a little less prone to getting 2 for 1, and it gives you another target, another 1-drop that you can hit with your Sheltered by Ghosts, which if you can turn 2 Sheltered by Ghosts, you usually win that game because of the Ward 2. Especially if you put it on something that, like Heartfire Hero, or even with the Optimistic Scavenger, being able to continuously pump things, is pretty oppressive. And then you've got the Emberheart Challenger for Dig, you've got the Manifold Mouse to give double strike, and we've talked about this deck a fair amount. We also see in the lands a ditch lowering 1 mountain and 1 plains to bring in the 2 copies of the Thran Portal, which with the life gain off of the Sheltered by Ghosts allows you to have the flexibility of a turn 1 and turn 1 red and turn 1 white more easily. So I kind of track the changes throughout the weeks to kind of give you guys an idea, if you're new to the deck, about what the flex spots are. So if you are thinking like maybe you want to try out a different card, I'd recommend taking out the Monastery Swiftspears, or maybe one of the Feather of Flights, for example. The other thing that I like to do for people who are new and returning to Magic is kind of give you an idea of where it sits in the meta. So Boros Auras is favored against Azorius Oculus, which we'll cover later. It's a coin flip against Rakdos Aggro and Golgari Midrange, and it is weak to mono black discard because of being able to 2 for 1 whatever you're targeting with the Sheltered by Ghosts before it resolves, with like Go for the Throat or Cut Down. The second top performing deck this week, according to Untapped from Bronze to Mythic, was Mardu Aggro. And Mardu Aggro is very similar to what we just talked about, except for you're including the Cal Sellsword to be able to fling it, and the Slick Shot Show Off to have kind of the turn 2 or the turn 3 win, where you play like a Monstrous Rage and end up dealing 20 damage directly to your opponent. So it's a new archetype, but it's a kind of a combination of Rakdos Aggro and Boros Auras. And so it's relatively new on the scene, so we'll see if it's kind of a blip. Sometimes we see these come in, and if you were planning on crafting, for example, I'm a little less confident in this one than I am in the Boros Auras, for example. Number 3, according to Untapped, is Rakdos Aggro, and we've seen this one around for a while too. A couple of changes this week, with the 2 copies of the Emberheart Challenger being dropped from the list, as well as 1 copy of the Slickshot Show-Off, and 2 copies of the Dreadmaw's Ire, which is the +2/+2 and trample, destroy an artifact after it's dealt damage to an opponent. And instead we're bringing up the Might of the Meeks up to 4 from last week. These were dropped down because they don't really help you with the turn 2 win or the turn 3 win. If you're unfamiliar with the deck, the turn 2 win is based off of the Leyline of Resonance, and having a Heartfight Hero or Cacophony Scamp that you hit with the turn inside out to give it the 7 power, and then you fling it with the Cal Sellsword to deal 3 times its damage for a total of 21. And then you also have the turn 3 that I mentioned previously, with off of the like turn inside out or Monstrous Rage on the Slickshot Show Off. That also works with the Felonious Rage. You just need 2 power to be able to get. You need 9 total power, 11 once you fling it on turn 3. As far as we also brought in 4 Shocks. So the 4 Shocks here allows us to have some interaction against the other Rakdos Aggro decks, and this is a very popular deck because it's relatively easy and relatively cheap to craft, and so you'll probably bump into this one a fair amount. From when I saw last, the Boros Auras and the Rakdos Aggro were pretty close to the most popular, around 15%. And the lands, ditching the 1 copy of the Sulphurous Springs, you do not need black to be able to play the Cal Sellsword, because the important part is the Burn Together sorcery. This deck is favored against Azorius Oculus, just like Boros Auras. It's a coin flip, though, against Boros Auras, really coming down to who has the play, because if they get the Sheltered by Ghosts, the lifelink kind of extends them out of reach of your turn 2 and turn 3 win. And then it's weak to mono black discard for the same reason as Boros Auras is weak, is that if you're shooting the target of your combat tricks, you get 2-for-1 by black instant speed removal. Number 4 was mono white control, and we've seen this one kind of pop up last week. And this is, I think, in tier 2 as opposed to tier 1. The last 3 I covered were standard deviation above the win rate of this deck. But it's still a very strong deck, and there are a lot of decks in tier 2 that are all kind of duking it out for the lower half of the best of 1, if you will. So compared to last week, we do see some changes. So we're ditching the Eternal Wanderer. We're ditching one of the Sanguine Evangelist, and this card, creating the 1/1 bat token, triggers a draw with the Caretaker's Talent, and but is prone to the board wipe strategies, right? We're bringing in 2 copies of the Enduring Innocence, which we saw in Best of 3 last week, but not in Best of 1. Usually Best of 3 does something first before it trickles its way down into Best of 1 and then is picked up by the tracker, which is another reason why I like to cover Best of 3. We're running 1 copy of the Lorn of the Third Path, which is a very common inclusion in Best of 3. 3 copies of the Soul Partition, and this one does hit non-land permanents, so remember that if you are up against a leyline, that you can bounce it to their hand, and then they have to cast it again for 6, which in the low land count of mono red or Rakdos Aggro basically just gets rid of that card. So just something to keep in mind. This one is ditching the 2 copies of the Builder's Talent, which is kind of usually is a card that's commonly included in the tokens control space. And we're also ditching the 2 copies of the Virtue of Loyalty, which creates the 2/2 token, and then also gives us kind of a mid-range win condition. And we are tweaking the lands a little bit. We're dropping a Mirix and a Plains to bring in the 4 copies of the Elegant Parlor. And you don't have red here, and in the Best of 3 decks, you'll see Imidane's Recruiter to play against like Domain. But it's still nice to have the Surveil in this archetype to be able to find to better smooth your land draws. And we also have the 2 copies of the Sunken Citadel, which works really well with activating the Fountain Port. This deck is favored against mono black discard and Rakdos Aggro, and it's a little bit more of a coin flip with Boros Auras. You could improve that matchup by bringing in something like Temporary Lockdown. Azorius Oculus is also difficult for this deck because of having like a single large threat like the Oculus or a Haughty Djinn that you then kind of have to use a Sunfall on 1-for-1, and then you're just trading down in too much value. And it's also weak to the Boros Tokens deck, which is a similar one that has the Urbresk's Forge. And you don't have a particularly great way to answer a Urbresk's Forge in this deck, and it's a very similar strategy. And speaking about mono white tokens, we have it show up for the first time in week 3 here. And so this is a new archetype, if you will. It's the first time it's shown up in the top 8. It's been around for a little bit, but we're starting to kind of see it pop up more in Best of 3, and then that, trickles down into Best of 1. So it's a little bit less of a control strategy, not having the Sunfalls on the top end, but is leaning more heavily into the token strategies off of Caretaker's Talent. And the Dollmaker's Shop is an excellent win condition in this deck, being able to trigger your card draw, but also then for 6 mana, making all of your creatures into huge threats. You have the Overlord of the Mistmoors, which creates the 2/1 flying inset creature tokens. You've got the Season of the Burrow for a little bit of, you can create 5 tokens with it, or exile 2 things and have them draw a card, or you can return something like Toby to the battlefield with an indestructible counter on it. Ghostly Dancers also allows you to return an enchantment from your graveyard to your hand. You can also use it to immediately unlock the Dollmaker's Shop, or the Porcelain Gallery, rather. And then also, every time that you play an enchantment, which this deck is doing basically every turn, you're creating a 3/1 white spirit creature token with flying. So Toby triggers the card draw off of the Caretaker's Talent. Some lists also include the Enduring Innocence, and the 1/1 then also triggers a card draw off of the Enduring Innocent. We do have the Split Up here instead of the Temporary Lockdown, which is another way of kind of answering the Boros Auras deck. And I'm kind of curious to see if Split Up starts to become a little bit more of a typical inclusion over the temporary lockdown. They do have some pros and cons, right? Caretaker's Talent gives us the trigger off of the token as well as the life gain. We've also got the Get Lost and the Elspeth Smite, which really helps against the Rakdos Aggro, giving us that instant speed interaction to disrupt their strategy. Also in tier 2 land and showing up for the first time is Dimir Rats. Seen this actually popping up a little bit more in best of 3, and not as much in best of 1. So it's not a particularly popular pick on the in the meta, but it is well positioned, or at least it was well positioned this last week. So you basically are centering everything around Vryn the Relentless. We did get the blue-black rat from Duskmourn that I'm blanking the name on that does the mill, and so we're not leaning into that, which does more graveyard synergies. And this is just more about flooding the board with rats with Lord Skitter, Sewer King. Karumonix, the Rat King, gives us some really good dig for additional rat threats. We've got some like Persistent Marsh Stalker outside of being exiled as a recurring threat. And then we've got the Go for the Throat and Cut Down and Disfigure to hate on mono red. Beastbinder can slow things down and is an unblockable creature a lot of the time. And then we've got one counterspell here, largely for preventing the counterspelling the Wrath. So you're gonna, Phantom Interference is in here to answer the Sunfall if it gets down to that point. We have Gix's Command in here that kind of helps up against some of the go wide strategies that we aren't bumping into as much, but still like Rakdos Lizards exists. I actually saw a bump in Celestia Rabbits this week. And then Link Breaker here giving us the good sack fodder and like good chumping fodder that's also just a cheap rat. And Virtue of Persistence gives us the life gain and removal, while also then giving us a late game win condition of bringing things back. So Vryn gives us rats that just get absolutely huge. If you haven't bumped into this archetype, Vryn's really, I think, the key card to making this whole thing work. Mono Red Aggro also made it onto the list. It made it onto the top 8 in week 1, wasn't in the top 8 in week 2. And it's basically doing the same thing that Rakdos Aggro is doing, but doesn't run the fling. And but does run, so you're lowering you're increasing your matchup against mono black discard from a weak matchup to a coin flip. But at the price of making it worse against like the Rakdos Aggro and the Boros Auras deck, which is kind of interesting, right? But you do have the shock and the lightning strike, which allows you to disrupt their plays. And as far as what we see between the weeks, this one dropped 3 copies of the Rockface Village to bring in 3 additional mountains, and just really leaning into like being able to manifold mouse and actually pay the offspring cost, for example. So this deck is a coin flip against Golgari Midrange and Azorius Oculus and mono black discard, and is weak to Rakdos Aggro and Boros Auras, which are very popular, the 2 most popular archetypes in the meta. That's kind of bringing this one down into number 7. At number 8, we have Azorius Oculus, and this one used to be in tier 1 and has kind of fallen down. And part of that is because of how weak it is to the Rakdos Aggro and the Boros Auras strategy. Just as those combined are bigger than just the surge we saw in Rakdos Aggro, it's difficult for this deck. That being said, though, we do see some changes to kind of address that. So we've dropped 2 copies of the Sleight of Hand to bring in 2 copies of Afara's Dispersal. And Afara's Dispersal then allows us to bounce the Rakdos Aggro or the Boros Auras target. It works a little bit better against the Rakdos Aggro deck because they commonly play the Sheltered by Ghosts without attacking with it first, right? So as far as Dispersal, you have to cast for 3 if they're targeting it on with the Sheltered by Ghosts. But it does help with the Rakdos Aggro. And but the rest of the deck is still the same since week 2, and is basically trying to ramp as quickly into a Haughty Djinn or an Oculus that you're bringing into play cheaply off of Helping Hand or Recommission after milling it or discarding it from your hand through cards like Picklock Prankster, Moment of Truth, and Chart a Course. And then you have Disruption of the Phantom Interference and the 3 steps ahead to mess with your opponent's plays. And now for best of 3. So like I mentioned, best of 3 is nice to pay attention to, even if you're a best of 1 player, because what we see in best of 1 often is inspired by the tournament winners in best of 3. So what every week I like to do is go over the top winners of the standard challenge, and since we had 4 tournaments, I'll be covering the first and second place winners Friday, both of Saturday's tournaments, and then Sunday. So on Friday we had Mono White Control by Gracias Portanto took down first place. That is the third first place in a row. Gracias Portanto has been killing it with this strategy. And we see, compared to last week, they dropped 1 Sanguine Evangelist and brought in the third copy of the Enduring Innocence. I think we're going to start seeing this play more in the token space in Mono White. And the rest of the deck is the same, though, very similar to the strategy that I talked about in Best of 1. And as far as the sideboard goes, we also see they kept relatively the same from last week, except for we're dropping 1 copy of the Imidane's Recruiter, going down to 2 instead of 3. Again, this one being a better option against Domain, and we're not seeing as much Domain in the tournaments. And we're bringing in a 4th copy of the Elspeth Smite to deal with the Dimir Midrange and the Gruul Aggro decks. I guess just really quickly to like rest in pieces in here for Azorius Oculus. Lorn of the Third Path is in here for killing the Forge. We've got the Boonbringer Valkyrie is a good stabilization against aggro strategies with the lifelink, and Temporary Lockdown is good against the smaller aggro strategies, and yeah. And second place was taken down by Golgari Midrange by Rasta F, and Golgari's Bane is Domain. And so since we're seeing less Domain, then Golgari has a time to kind of shine. And I actually thought Golgari was going to shine really bright, because we all thought that the Domain was going to go away when the Triomes went away, and it's actually been quite functional without it. But it has some bad matchups, and because of the incredible amount of popularity of Dimir Midrange, has been kind of heavily countered by that choice. And so we've seen Golgari Midrange made a top 4 finish last week and then did so again this week. And this one is more of a standard approach to Golgari Midrange. I'd say last week was a little bit more of an exploration. So we see that like the Free Strider Lookout's not in here. The Harvester of Misery was cut, as well as the Iridescent Vine Lasher. And we've got the Archfiend of the Dross, which is particularly problematic for red to deal with, and I think has to do with how much Gruul Aggro we've been seeing. And we've also got 4 copies of the Caustic Bronco, which helps, especially with these with Glissa and the Tranquil Frillback and the Sentinel of the Nameless City. I really like the inclusion of the Caustic Bronco, because you can actually saddle it on turn 3 quite easily, and then hit into, draw a Virtue of Persistence off the top, and you can swing an incredible amount of damage that way. But even if you can't saddle it, it also gives you good card draw at the expense of life. Shieldred the Apocalypse is in here, another one that's really good against aggro, and kind of is another signal to me that the creator or the pilot of this deck was kind of leaning against those aggro matchups. And Tranquil Frillback also works as stabilizing against aggro by the 4 life gain, and then also works well against Artifact and Enchantment Hate, and exiles somebody's graveyard is really great against Azorius Oculus. So I think the Tranquil Frillback has been pretty well positioned, and is definitely something you could play in the main. As far as the interaction goes, we got a 4th copy of the Cutdown, again for the aggro. We've got a single copy of the Terra Sunder for Artifact and Enchantment Hate that you can then pay the kicker to exile. And we're ditching the Ghost Vacuums, which we haven't seen as much as Azorius Oculus, and I like that being taken out of the main and brought in when you need some graveyard hate. We're also ditching the Meat Hook Massacre number 2 and 2 copies of the Virtue of Persistence to bring in 2 copies of the Unholy Annex. And this is definitely seeing more play. It works well with the Archfiend of the Dross, as well as just the demon that it can create on its own. And it kind of fits into the value game of getting that additional card draw in Golgari. As far as the lands go, we've ditched the Fabled Passage and the Sunken Citadel, and brought in a Forest and Llanowar Wastes, up to 4, bringing in the Painland, and brought in a Swamp and Underground Mortuary up as well. And as far as the best of 3 sideboard goes, We've got one less Anoint with Affliction, dropping the Ghost Vacuum entirely, so not even bringing in as a sideboard option, and dropping the Hostile Investigator, which is good against control matchups to attack their hand. Taking out one Terra Sunder that's being brought into the main, but still has 2 in the sideboard. And we're dropping the End, and the 2 Tranquil Frillbacks were taken from the sideboard and brought into the main. And Cruel Claw's Heist was brought in, which is kind of like a duress effect, being able to attack your opponent's hand. And we've also got the Disfigure, which works really well against the Heartfire Hero Gruul Aggro deck that we're seeing a lot of with the Leyline. That we'll be talking about a version of it a little bit later here. And the Gix's Command, again, there's certain matchups that this is particularly nice against, and Nissa Ascended Animist. The same goes for this one. Artifact and Enchantment Hate, and then if they're particularly good at gumming up the board, you can use this to get an overrun effect to give your creatures trample. All right, first place on Saturday was taken down by Golgari Midrange by Primetime, and was the exact same list as Rasta F, except for had 1 less Tranquil Frillback, and instead was running a 3rd copy of the Archfiend of the Dross. So we'll be skipping that one. It had the same sideboard, and is pretty much a duplicate list. Second place on Saturday was taken down by Azorius Control by WCL, and this is a new archetype for Duskmourn. We haven't seen a top finish by Azorius Control, and so we're bringing in a lot of things that we have been seeing in Azorius Control before. So like we've got the Beza, we've got 2 copies of the Caretaker's Talent, so leaning a little bit further away from the token strategy. Hornlock Whale for bouncing early interaction from Gruul Aggro. The Eternal Wanderer works really well for blinking Beza back and forth. No More Lies and 3 Steps Ahead is a full playset to counter everything. Negate. Lots of things are non-creature spells right now. There's not a, the Rakdos Lizards has kind of died down a little bit, and we're not seeing as heavy as these really heavy creature-only spell lists. So mainboarding the negates, I think, makes a lot of sense. Deduce works really well for against the mid-range matchups where they might be playing around your counterspell, and then you can draw instead. Get Lost, giving you the enchantment, Planeswalker hate as long as the map tokens aren't too detrimental. And we've got the Sunfall to wrath the board as well. And the new card that we got from Duskmourn is the Overlord of the Flood Pits, which gives you the draw 2, discard 1 to give you additional value, as well as just being a large threat as a 5/3 flyer. As far as the sideboard goes, we've got a full playset of Elspeth Smite for up against Dimir Aggro or Dimir Midrange, Gruul Aggro. Rest in Peace again against Azorius Oculus, anything that cares about the graveyard, Reanimator strategies. You could bump the negates up to a full playset of 4 if you're up against a very spell-heavy list. We've got the Temporary Lockdown that we could bring up as well if we're playing up against a small strategy like the Rakdos Lizards and such. Tashana's Tidebinder is really nice against other Planeswalkers. So if you're bumping into something that's like dependent on Jace for a win condition, Tashana's Tidebinder then can kind of silence that Planeswalker. Works okay against Liliana of the Veil as well. And Stoic Sphinx here as an alternative win against the other control decks. If you can get a Stoic Sphinx to stick on the board, then you're pretty good as long as you can protect it from wraths with your counterspells. All right, there were 2 tournaments on Saturday, and the second set of tournaments, the first place was taken down by Azorius Control by Misplaced Ginger. And looking at this list, you might be like, it's not Azorius, but it does have Jace. But anyway, it's mostly a mono-white control deck that then is running blue instead of red, right? So like the red being for the Amadean's Recruiter, this one is instead bringing in the blue for Jace. So if we compare this to the mono-white control list by Gracias Portanto that I just covered, there's a lot of similarities. So we've got the Archangel Elspeth, we're bringing that one up to 3 copies. We've ditched the 1 of copy of Lauren of the Third Path, as well as the 2 copies of the Sanguine Evangelist, to bring in a full playset of the Enduring Innocence, as well as 1 copy of Exercise. And we're ditching the 3 soul partitions in favor of the Parting Gust, which allows us to kind of blink our Beza, and it is an alternative that we see kind of being played in some decks over the Soul Partition. And As far as the lands go, we ditched the Elegant Parlor and the Sunken Citadels, and to bring in one additional Plains and the Meticulous Archive so that we can bring in Jace from the sideboard. And as far as the sideboard goes, we see a complete rework compared to Gracias's deck. And so we've ditched the Boonbringer Valkyries, the 4 copies of the Elspeth Smite, the 2 copies of the Emidane's Recruiter, as well as the 2 copies of the Lauren of the Third Path, to bring in 3 copies of Exercise, and 2 copies of Jace the Perfected Mind, and one additional copy of Rest in Peace. And honestly, I think 4 is a little bit much. I think 3 is already maybe too much. I like 2, but I can see 3 because of Azorius Oculus. 4 seems crazy to me because they're not good in pairs, right? They're not good if they're not redundant, right? Or they are redundant, so they're not good in multiples. So we've also got the Sarah Paragon, which we see in this archetype sometimes, being able to replay your stuff, especially if you're up against red removal that doesn't exile, then this can be a nice card to bring back in to replay everything. And then we have a full playset of Temporary Lockdown against the board flood strategies. And second place on Saturday was taken down by a Gruul Aggro or Gruul Prowess by O. Daniel Akos. And if we compare this one to week 1, which I think was the last time that I covered Gruul Aggro, we can see that they decided to take out the leyline and go for a different approach. So because we're not going for the turn 2 win, we've dropped the 4 copies of the Cacophony Scamp, we've dropped the 3 copies of the Picnic Ruiner, and I thought that one was interesting because, like, the last week it brought in the Witch's Mark and was kind of like better at giving the Picnic Ruiner trample, and so you already had the double strike off of the Picnic Ruiner's ability, and so I thought it was kind of an interesting way to go about it. This one is leaning a little bit more into what we saw previously before Duskmourn, bringing in the questing druids, the innkeeper's talent kind of stuff. So we've got a full playset of Manifold Mouse to give double strike to our Heartfire hero and our Emberheart Challenger. We're bringing in the questing druid, which helps us with additional dig since we got rid of the Witch's Mark. We brought in the 4 copies of the Slickshot Show-Off, and I think it's pretty standard. Some people even call this the Gruul like Slickshot deck, yeah, it's a very powerful card, right? Especially with being able to protect it from the instant speed interaction with Snakeskin Veil. So we're ditching the 3 copies of the Witch's Mark, and which I think paired better with the Leyline of Resonance, because when you did Witch's Mark, you would get a double effect on it and it would ping your opponent, which is kind of cool. And we're also getting rid of the Turn Inside Out, which was another part of the Leyline package, as well as the Leyline of Resonance, to bring back in the Innkeeper's Talent, which can repeatedly trigger the Valiant off of Heartfire Hero, and kind of gives a nice mid-range kind of feel to the deck instead of going for turn 2 wins. And we tweaked the lands a little bit, dropped a mountain, dropped 2 copies of the Thornspire Verge, to bring in 2 copies of the Restless Ridgeline, the Manland, as well as 2 copies of the Rockface Village, which plays more as a combat trick than it does actually a land, to be able to repeatedly trigger your Valiant triggers. And as far as the best of 3 sideboard goes, we can see that they also did a rework here. They dropped 2 copies of the Obliterating Bolt, but they did keep 1. Dropped the 2 copies of the Twisted Fealty, which I like, because if we're not trying to finish the game as early, then we don't need to kind of steal one of our opponent's blockers for the last bit of damage, and that strategy doesn't work as well. Urbrask's Forge, we also dropped down from 4 copies to 3. I think there's a lot of hate for Urbrask's Forge right now, with the Lorens and such, Exercise, etc. And bringing in 1 copy of the Ghost Vacuum to help up against Azorius Oculus, and 2 copies of the Pick Your Poison, which is usually a sideboard that's brought in against Domain. Really good at being able to blow up Atraxas, Archangels, the Beanstalk, etc. And we're bringing in 2 copies of the Scorching Shot, and this one just kind of like, it could be a Witchstalker's Frenzy, it can be a Scorching Shot, like just anything that is a problematic blocker that can kind of gum up the ground. If they're playing like a mid-range threat, like, Shieldred always comes to mind when I'm thinking about these things, for why you would bring in the Scorching Shot. All right, and now on to Sunday's tournament. We've got Azorius Oculus, And this one took down, first place by SWAF. And it's very similar to the one that we covered last week. We've dropped 2 copies of Get Lost to bring in a 4th copy of the Into the Floodmaw and a 4th copy of Moment of Truth. So kind of undoing what the previous week had done. The rest of the deck is exactly the same, and it's a very similar strategy to Best of 1. And the Best of 3 sideboard, we also see a couple of tweaks, nothing crazy. So we've got 1 less copy of Elspeth's Smite, dropped the 2 copies of the Monastery Mentor, which was pointed out to me as an alternative if your opponent is bringing in a lot of graveyard hate. The Monastery Mentor works a little bit better if you're experiencing that. So moving away from that strategy, and instead we're bringing in the 2 copies of the Doorkeeper Thrall, and this one is really great for ETBs, right? So I think Sunday we see a sideboards that were being included to kind of tech against Domain a little bit more heavily with your pick your poisons. Doorkeeper Thrall also works really well against Domain, silencing Atraxa's ETB, the Archangel's ETBs, etc. And we've also got 1 copy of the Soul Partition, which again kind of helps up against the Leyline decks and the early pressure. And second place was taken down by Jeskai Convoke by Quixote. And I'm kind of happy to see this one. So we lost Voltaren Epicure in Boros Convoke, and some people were exploring the Spyglass Siren as a replacement since you get a map token. It fits into the strategy of blowing up that artifact with Gleeful Demolition for a turn 2 Knight Errant of Eos, to then follow it up with a turn 3 Imidane's Recruiter if the stars align. But we also see some stuff that coming in from Duskmourn that I think fits perfectly into the archetype. So we've got Clockwork Percussionist, which can be a target for the Gleeful Demolition, and then gives us the drawing into things later. The Sheltered by Ghosts is an amazing, mythic level uncommon, and I'm not surprised to see it sneaking its way into here. The Painter's Studio, giving all of your creatures +1/+0 for 1 and a red, and then late game dig off of the Painter's Studio side instead of the Defaced Gallery, works pretty well, kind of like a case of the Gateway Express that doesn't need to be solved before it's giving you that +1/+0. So Boros still trying to figure its way out back into the meta, and as we saw a little bit in Best of 1, the more heavily that we kind of shift into, so like on yesterday when I talked about in my Best of 1 meta breakers, we Boros Convoke was one of them, right? And as we see more and more popularity go towards the single point interaction of black, then you start seeing this deck pop up because the go wide strategy counters the single point interaction. So as far as the Best of 3 sideboard goes, we've got Arabella as a 1 of, which I thought was kind of intriguing. Protect the Negotiators helps against Wraths. Get Lost is particularly nice against Temporary Lockdown. Same with the Destroy Evil. Torch the Towers are really great if you're up against the Leyline decks. Also, I forgot to mention that in the other Gruul aggro deck, like when you're on the play versus the draw, when you're on the draw, you're going to want the Torch the Towers in the mirror match. Rest in Peace, again, really good against Azorius Control. 4 copies of Sheltered by Ghosts if it's a lifelink is particularly nice. There's some decks where Sheltered by Ghosts just wins the game. So with that, thank you very much for listening to my ramblings. If you're new to my community, welcome. I do one of these every Monday. It's one of my favorite things to just kind of talk about what's happening in Best of 1 and Best of 3 standard. And I'll throughout the week, I'll post some videos. Tomorrow I've got a draft video. I won't put out a notification or anything, but if you want to watch it, it's I've been enjoying the draft side of things as well. And on Sunday I'll be doing another Best of 1 meta breaker where we kind of look at like mythic decks that were off meta picks. If you want to see last week's, you can go watch the video from yesterday. And then so take care, everybody. Have a wonderful week, and I'll catch you all later.